In this session, we will discuss about optimistic concurrency control techniques. In all the concurrency control techniques that have been discussed so far, a certain degree of checking is done before a database operation can be executed. For example, in the locking mechanism, a check is done to determine whether the item being accessed is locked or not. In the timestamp ordering algorithm, the transaction timestamp is checked against the read and the write timestamps of the item. Now, such checking represents overhead during a transaction execution, with the effect of slowing down the transactions. Optimistic concurrency control, also known as validation or certification techniques. Now, in this scheme, the updates in the transactions are not directly applied to the database items until the transaction reaches its end. Now, during a transaction execution, all updates are applied to local copies of the data items that are kept for transaction. And finally, at the end of the transaction, a validation phase checks whether any of the transaction updates is violating the serializability or not. If serializability is not violated, the transaction is committed and the database is updated from the local copies. So basically, in this validation protocol, there are three phases. The first phase, the read phase. Now, a transaction can read values of committed data items from the database. However, the updates that are applied only to local copies of the data items are kept in the transaction workspace. The next phase is the validation phase, wherein a checking is performed to ensure that the serializability will not be violated if the transaction updates are applied to the databases. So basically, it is checking if there are any conflicts here or not. And in the third phase, that is the write phase, updation is done in the database. So if the validation phase is successful, that is the second phase is successful, then the transaction updates are applied to the database. Otherwise, the updates are discarded and the transaction is restarted. So basically, this concurrency control protocol is divided into three phases. The first being the read phase, the validation phase, and the write phase. In the read phase, updation is done locally. In the validation phase, it checks if there are any conflicts, and finally the updations are written in the database. The optimistic protocol that is described here uses transaction timestamp and also requires that the write sets and the read sets of the transaction be kept in the system. The start and the end times for some of the three phases need to be kept in each transaction. The write set of transaction is the set of items it writes, and the read set is the set of items it reads. In the validation phase for transaction TI, the protocol checks that TI does not interfere with any committed transactions or with any other transaction currently in their validation phase. The validation phase for transaction TI checks that for each such transaction TJ that is either committed or is in its validation phase, one of the following condition holds. So the first condition says that the transaction TJ completes its write phase before TI starts its read phase. The second condition, TI starts its write phase after Tj completes its write phase, and the read set of Ti has no items in common with the write set of Tj. And the last condition is both the read set and write set of Ti have no items in common with the write set of Tj, and Tj completes its read phase before Ti completes its read phase. Now when validating transaction Ti, the first condition is checked first for each transaction Tj, since the first condition is the simplest condition to check. Only if first is false, condition 2 is checked, and only if 2 is false, condition 3, which is one of the most complex to validate, is checked. If any of these 3 condition holds, that means there is no interference and transaction Ti is validated successfully. If none of these 3 condition holds, the validation of transaction Ti fails and it is aborted and restarted later because interference may have been occurred.